Hey guys, what's up? This is Benny Ricciardi with rotocurve.com, and I'm here to bring you our quarterback selections for DraftKings Week 1 NFL. A lot of you asked us if we were going to do something along the lines of Benny's Bats for NFL, so here's basically the way we're going to break it down. I'm going to be handling a lot of the DraftKings stuff this season, and Josh is going to be handling a lot of the FanDuel stuff. We're going to go and bring you guys some videos, probably on a daily basis throughout the week, giving you a breakdown of position by position. So we're going to go quarterback one day, running backs another day, wide receivers another day. This way we hit on everything and kind of talk about everything and give everything the time that it really deserves. What we like to do is we're going to look at the quarterbacks that are out there. We're going to look at the defense that they're going up against, and we're going to look at things like the spread, the probable game script, and figure out which guys based on price are going to be good for us to use in our rosters. So the first game we're going to talk about is going to be the Thursday night game, and that's the game between the Patriots and the Steelers. Tom Brady is going to be a great play here. He's $7,700, so that's pretty cheap. The Pittsburgh team has allowed the sixth most points to fantasy quarterbacks last year. So fantasy quarterbacks scored the sixth most points against this Pittsburgh defense. Let's see. The running game is a little bit of a mess right now up in New England, so I think they're going to rely a lot on trying to move the ball through the air. And also, this is, might be a little bit of a narrative street right here, but Tom Brady and Belichick are pretty pissed off about this whole Deflategate thing. So you know that they're going to come out and try to prove a point, especially at the beginning of the season right here, right off the bat, opening game. It's a 52 over-under, and the Patriots are favored by 7. And the Patriots are one of those teams that even when they're up late, that doesn't mean that they're going to try to run the clock out. You know, those short passes that Tom Brady throws with high efficiency, it's basically like long handoffs for them. So while they will run and make the clock move if they are up big late in the game, I also think that they're the kind of team that doesn't really take their foot off the gas. If they have a chance to score some points, they're going to do it. So I don't mind using a guy like Brady, even though he's the favorite. I think he's going to have a big game. I think he's going to throw for a lot of yards. And as much as I don't like playing the Thursday slate, I think if you are playing the Thursday slate, he's definitely somebody you got to consider. Now, knowing the way he is, you know that he's probably going to spread out a lot of the passes and a lot of the touchdowns. The one guy who I would use with him is probably Rob Gronkowski. But other than that, I don't think I'm looking to take too many of the Patriot players outside of Brady. On the other side of that game, you have Ben Roethlisberger. Now, this is a little bit tougher situation for me. New England wasn't bad last year against the pass, but remember, they lost guys like Revis. They lost guys like Vince Wilfork. You know, there's a little bit of a changeover going on in that defense. So you're going to see some new faces out there. I don't know if they're going to be better. Obviously, Belichick's a great coach, but he's usually somebody that needs time to coach up his players. So right off the bat, they might not be amazing, but I think this is going to wind up being a pretty solid defense. Roethlisberger is 7,300, so he's not really all that cheap. They are going to be playing from behind most likely, and he doesn't have much of a running game with Lev Bell suspended for the first couple games of the season. So I do think that there's a little bit of merit to using him, but I don't think I love him as much. If I'm taking any quarterback on Thursday, it's going to be Tom Brady. Next game we can talk about, we got Ryan Tannehill going up against that Washington Redskins defense. That Redskins defense allowed the most points to fantasy quarterbacks last year in 2015. I think that's why you're hearing a lot of sharp players on a guy like Tannehill and talking him up this week. At 7,400, he's going to kind of get lost in the mix a bunch of, other quarterbacks who people are talking about a little more, guys that are a little more expensive than him, guys that are a little less expensive than him. So he could wind up going off pretty low owned. And remember, towards the end of last season, he was throwing for 300 yards, a couple touchdown passes every game. So I think that he could be in a good spot here as well. The over-under on this game is kind of small, though. It's only 43, and his Miami team is favored by 4, so they may not be passing all that much towards the end of the game. He does have a lot of weapons this year. They brought in Jason Cameron to give him a good tight end option. Jarvis Landry is, coming to his own and really become a pretty solid receiver, a good possession guy, and a guy who, basically is going to make a couple fantasy rosters of mine this year, especially on a PPR site. They brought in Devontae Parker, the rookie, who probably won't see much action here because he's coming off an injury, but he's going to be somebody to watch going forward too. And they have 4 or 5 other guys who are pretty decent options for wide receivers for Tannehill. I don't know if there's somebody I'd really want to stack him with either, but I do think he could have a pretty good game. Like I said, my biggest concern, though, is if they're up, They might not be passing the ball all that much late, so I don't know if he's going to be able to pay off a salary of 73, 7,400. But he is somebody that I have seen a lot of sharp players talking about this week. And based on the matchup against the team that was, allowed the most points to fantasy quarterbacks last year, you can kind of see why. My other concern is on the other side of this game, we can talk about Kirk Cousins. Cousins is only $5K, so he's minimum price, and he has put up a couple games where he threw around 20 points or so, which would give him 4 points per $1,000 of cost. So that alone makes him somebody that's at least an interesting option here. Miami was tough with the quarterback fantasy points last year. And remember, they just went out and got Ndamukong Suh as well. And Suh was one of those guys who helped that Detroit team be as tough as they were on quarterbacks last year as well. So I can only think that adding him to the mix is going to help. I don't think this is a very good spot here for Cousins. Cousins is a guy that's been mistake prone, through 9 interceptions last year and only 204 pass attempts. So I think that, this could be a tough spot for him. Even though he's cheap and people are going to be tempted to use him, they should be throwing late. They should be behind. I just don't think he's going to be very efficient, and I do worry about the turnovers here. So I don't think Cousins is a guy I'd really like to roll out there. Next guy we can talk about is Cam Newton. Now, Cam's in a low over-under game here, favored by 3. Remember, he lost his top option from last year in Kelvin Benjamin, and I just think that this is going to be more of a ground game. I don't think that Carolina is going to be looking to throw the ball all that much. I do really like Jonathan Stewart, who we'll talk about when we get to the running backs. I think they're going to feed him a lot. I think he's going to get 20, 25 carries, and they're going to kind of rely on him. So Cam is not a guy that I'd be willing to spend up $7,600 for in this game. On the other side of this game, you got Bortles, $5,900, which is a pretty cheap price, 41 over under, and they are a 3-point underdog. So he was really, really not good last year. Carolina's D did give up a decent amount of points to quarterbacks. They were 10th for quarterback fantasy points last season. I mean, I know that Bortles is likely going to be throwing late. I know that he's at home. I guess you can kind of make an argument for him on that account. But, I mean, if you look at his numbers last year, this guy was pretty bad. And I just don't think I want to put money behind a guy who, basically doesn't have a lot of talent, or at least hasn't shown it yet if he does. I mean, he's going to need to take a big step forward before I would consider putting, serious money on the line for fantasy games on his back. Let's see. We got Josh McCown against the Jets. This is a horrendous spot for him. The Jets got Revis and Cromartie back now on the outside. He doesn't have a lot of weapons. I think this Jet defense is going to do a number on him. Jets are probably going to be one of the higher-owned defenses this week. We don't need to waste any more time talking about Josh McCown. On the other side of that game, you got Ryan Patrick, favored by 3. But again, even Fitzpatrick, I think it's going to be a very run-dominant game from the Jets. I think they're going to play good defense. I think they're going to feed Chris Ivory. And I think they're going to wind up walking away with a low-scoring win in this game. So I'm not really on either one of these quarterbacks. Yes, they are both cheap. But again, if the Jets are winning, is Fitzpatrick really going to be throwing? I know he has Brandon Marshall on one side, Eric Decker on the other side. That's a pretty good set of wide receivers. But again, if you're expecting the Jets to be winning this game, how much are they going to be throwing? If anything, I kind of expect the Cleveland team to be throwing it a little more, trying to come from behind. But there's nobody in that passing game that I really like. So even though McCown is 5,200 and Fitzpatrick is 5,500, I don't really think I want to use either one of these guys in this game. Next guy we can talk about, Aaron Rodgers. Now, this is a great matchup for Aaron Rodgers. Obviously, he's expensive as anything at 8,600, but Chicago allowed the second most fantasy points to quarterbacks last year. In 2 games against them last year, Aaron Rodgers threw for 10 touchdown passes. So obviously, he likes playing against his defense. He's obviously had success playing against them. The over-under on this game is 50. The Packers are favored by about 6.5 right now. But my biggest concern here with Aaron Rodgers, again, is the same one that we've had, with some of these other quarterbacks. How much is he going to be throwing the ball in the third and fourth quarter if they're really up big here? If they're up big, you got to think that you're going to see a heavy dose of Eddie Lacy in the second half. And, again, he just lost his number 1 receiver in Jordy Nelson. So you don't know where the targets are going to go. You should expect, an uptick for a guy like Devontae Adams, a guy like Richard Rodgers, who we'll talk about when we talk about tight ends. I mean, these are guys that could wind up catching some passes, but I just think if they're up a couple touchdowns early, which looks pretty likely in this game, how much are you really going to get out of him? So he may be one of those guys who gets you 25 fantasy points in the first half, but he might wind up with 27 or 28 fantasy points for the game because I just don't think they're going to need him too much in the second half. So that's my only concern here. Obviously, it's a great matchup for him. You just have to kind of figure out if you're willing to take the risk that he won't do a lot in the second half of this game. On the other side, you're going to have Jay Cutler, who I think is going to need to throw the ball quite a bit here, which is a tough situation for him to be in. He's only 6,800, so it's not very expensive. But Green Bay was towards the bottom third of the league last year for fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks. This is a pretty good defense. You know, they're not great, but they're not horrible either. I don't think it's going to be an easy day for Cutler. And here's my other big concern. Alshon Jeffries has not practiced in a month right now. And instead of saying, yeah, he'll be good, or, you know, kind of hinting that he'll be there, the coach is kind of keeping it, you know, pretty tight-lipped. So even if Jeffries does wind up playing, I have a feeling that he's not going to be 100%, and he's not going to be the guy that we're expecting him to be. So with Kevin White already being out, Brandon Marshall off, you know, to New York to be on the Jets, I mean, you're looking at guys like Marquise Wilson and Eddie Royal. Not as your slot receiver or even coming in as your second, but those are going to be the two guys on the outside in this game. So I think that a lot of the passes are going to go the way of, you know, a guy like a Martellus Bennett, or maybe even out of the backfield to a guy like a Forte. But again, is that going to be enough for Cutler to really make value? I don't think he's going to be able to put up a lot of points, basically playing with his B team and wide receivers. His skill position players are definitely weak. If they get down in this game where they can't rely on Forte, that's going to be a problem for them. Next guy I want to talk about is Andrew Luck. Now, Luck has a tough matchup against a very good Buffalo defense. It's a low total in this game, but I think Luck could be pretty sneaky for a tournament. He's a guy that you could play naked, and what that means is a lot of times we talk about, you know, handcuffing a quarterback with one of his receivers. With Luck, because he spreads the ball around to so many guys, you really don't need to handcuff him with anybody. You can take him by yourself and then just go and try to find high-scoring players at other positions in order to make him fit in. I think he'll be low owned because he has a really high price. I think he's 9,200. I don't know if I would use him in cash games, but I do think that he is a tournament option, basically because he's one of the best quarterbacks in the league and somebody that people are expecting a lot out of this year. So I think he might be a little bit of a sneaky play at low ownership in a GPP. He has the ability to go out there and throw for 300 yards and 3 or 4 touchdowns against any defense. So I think that you know, he's somebody that's worth taking a flyer on in a GPP tournament, especially some of these larger fields, because I don't think a lot of people are going to have him. It could give you a leg up. Next guy we're going to talk about is Tyrod Taylor. Now, I know everybody's talking about the min-price quarterback and using Tyrod Taylor. I like that strategy a little bit more over on FanDuel. On DraftKings, I think you can find enough value at other positions where you don't have to go min-price at quarterback. A guy like Taylor, you're going to need to get about 20 points out of him. So let's figure out how to do that at a $5,000 cost. If he throws for, he's probably only going to throw 20, maybe 25 times if they're trailing and they have to come from behind. So you're figuring probably about 150 yards, 170 yards maybe. So that's probably like 6 or 7 points. There's a good chance he'll throw at least 1 interception or have 1 fumble. So you're dropping it down to 5 points right there. Maybe he runs for, you know, let's give him a high estimate. We'll say 40, 45, 50 yards. That's going to be another 5 points, which gets you to 10. And if he has 1 touchdown, even if it is with his legs where he gets 6 points instead of with his arm where he only gets 4, you're still only at 16 points there. You would need about 175 yards, 50 yards rushing, 1 touchdown rushing, 1 touchdown passing, and no negative events like no fumbles or no interceptions in order for him to pay off his salary. Can he do that? Yes, I think he can. But I don't think that it's a slam dunk like people are talking about it. So if you want to use Tyrod Taylor in a cash game as your quarterback so you can go and get studs at every position, you know, I think it's okay, but I don't think it's something that I'm looking to do on DraftKings. Now, on FanDuel, it's a different story. But on DraftKings, I don't think you can need to do it. You can get some of those guys like a Devontae Adams, you know, maybe even an Eddie Royal if you like him, although I'm not as high on him anymore as I was. You can put guys like that into your lineup at cheap prices and still make it work while paying up to get a quarterback who has more upside. And I think that's probably the way you want to go. So I am not on Tyrod Taylor for either tournaments or cash games over on DraftKings. I just wanted to make that clear. Next guy we can talk about is Andy Dalton. Dalton goes up against Oakland. Oakland gave up the 10th most points to fantasy quarterbacks last season. So he is in a pretty good matchup here. Cincinnati is favored, and Oakland, basically, you know, my biggest concern here is I think Cincinnati is going to get up. Oakland's run defense is really, really bad. So if their run defense is that bad, once Cincinnati gets a lead, I kind of have a feeling they're just going to sit there and feed Jeremy Hill maybe even mix in a little bit of Gio Bernard. So I don't know how much volume he's going to get in the second half. I do think he could have a really good first half throwing the ball. I think he can get 2 touchdowns, maybe even in the first quarter, and put them up big. But I don't know if he's going to do much more after that. Now, his price is only $6,100, so you need about 24 points out of him. If he gets 300 yards and 3 touchdowns, that would get you to 27 basically and be exactly what you needed. But is he going to throw enough to get 300 yards, and are they going to let him throw it enough to get 3 touchdowns? You know, if they get up a touchdown or 2 early, I think they're going to wind up just handing the ball off and chewing up the clock. So I don't think that there's a great upside for him, but I do think that there's a chance for him to have a pretty good game at a really square price. On the other side of that game, you got Derek Carr, who's also 6,100. Since he gave up the 4th fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks last year. So it's not a very good matchup. I do understand what people are saying that, oh, well, Carr's going to be losing and he's going to be throwing the ball a lot. But he's very inefficient, and efficiency is something that you really have to look at with a quarterback. It's one thing for a guy to throw the ball 50 times, but if he's throwing 2 or 3 interceptions and only completing 40% of his passes, you know, you don't get points for pass attempts. You get points for yards, which means he needs to be completing passes, moving his team down the field, getting closer to the end zone, and getting points by scoring touchdowns. And I just don't see him doing all those things today. So even though he is cheap, and I agree with people, he might throw the ball 50 times. Just because he throws it 50 times doesn't mean he's going to rack up a whole bunch of yards and positive events. We've seen before that guys have had high volume passes and just not come up with big scores. So I think you got to temper your expectation a little bit here. I understand the case people are making for Carr. I just don't think it's the right one. Next guy we can talk about, Marcus Mariota. Now, the Bucs defense gave up the 12th most points to fantasy quarterbacks last year. Mariota is going to be an underdog, so he should be throwing the ball late. But he doesn't really have a lot of weapons that make me think that even if he is throwing the ball, it's going to be anything positive, to be honest with you. He is cheap. I think he's only about $6,000. I just don't see him having a ton of upside. The only way I think he pays this off is if he uses his legs and runs in a touchdown, comes up with a big rushing yardage thing, which, again, he can do. You know, he is a little bit in that mold of like a Russell Wilson, and people always underestimate Russell Wilson, but the yards that he picks up with his legs adds up pretty fast. Remember, for rushing yards, you get 1 point for every 10, whereas passing yards, you get 1 point for every 25. So a guy who's throwing for, 200 yards is basically the equivalent of a guy who can rush for 80. So if you can get a guy like Mariota who can rush for break a big run for 30 or 40 yards and end up with 60 or 70 yards rushing and a touchdown, that's 13 points right there, not even including anything he does with his arm, another couple 100 yards and maybe a touchdown through the air. I just don't see it here today, though, against a tough Tampa Bay team. I think Tampa's going to be winning. I think they're going to be running, so I don't like Marcus Mariota on the other side of this game as well. He does have some very good receivers, but if they're going to be winning, Tennessee had the 2nd worst run defense last year. So if Tampa Bay gets a lead, I think they are going to just sit there and feed, the muscle hamster, who I think is going to be a sneaky play as well. We'll talk about Doug Martin, when we get to the running backs. But I think that's going to be another situation to look at. Let's see. We got Eli against Dallas. I really like this matchup for Eli. Remember, Dallas, who was decent against the pass last year, but Orlando Scandrick is out right now. And even though he was kind of like their slot corner, he was also the only guy who really had the speed to stay with Odell Beckham. So I think the Giants, something that people underestimate with the Giants is they run that kind of no huddle where they get up to the line and Eli stands there and he looks at the field and he sees where the weakness is and he changes the play around, kind of like his brother ran for all those years in Indianapolis and Denver. And the thing about that is the Giants wound up running the 4th most plays of any team in the league last year. So even though people don't consider the Giants a fast-paced team, they do play at a very fast pace. They get a lot of plays off. And if you get a lot of plays off and you're basically going up to the line and looking and trying to figure out what the weakness is, Eli is now given the freedom to make those calls. So if he thinks that staying in a pass is the right thing to do, he's going to stay and throw those quick passes. And, with a receiver like a guy like Odell Beckham who can get off the line fast and make those catches, I think Eli's going to rack up a lot of yards here. There's a high over-under in this game. Dallas is actually favored, so you got to figure Eli's going to be passing. And again, with a high high total in this game, you got to figure there's going to be some touchdowns on the board. So I think Eli can throw a couple touchdowns here. That Dallas team is susceptible to some touchdown passes, especially from the tight end position. And I think without Scandrick, I think it'll be easier for the wide receivers on the outside as well. So I definitely think Eli is somebody to consider here. 7,400. not too pricey, and I do think that people are kind of sleeping on him a little bit. I haven't heard his name mentioned all that much. There's a couple other guys in that price range who I think are getting a lot more love, and I think Eli could fly under the radar and give you a big return. Now, on the other side of that game, I also really like Tony Romo. The Giants were 7th last year for the most QB points allowed, and they lost their best pass rusher in JPP, and they also just lost their best linebacker in Beeson. So right now, this is a defense that's struggling a little bit and hurting a little bit. I know everybody thinks of Dallas as a running team, but think about it. They lost to Marco Murray, and obviously they can't be too happy with the running back situation if they just went out and traded for another guy in Christian Michael. They're basically just trying to find somebody who can carry the ball for them. So I do think they're going to rely a little bit more on the pass than people are expecting them to. Des Bryant is an absolute stud. He's one of the best receivers in the game, so I think Romo can hook up with him. And remember, they're favored in this game as well. So the Giants playing at a fast pace is also going to mean more plays for them. The fact that they don't have the running game that they had last year means they might not be relying on it that much. I think this is a sneaky spot for Romo as well. I like both of the quarterbacks in this game. I think it's a high over-under game, and I think that you're going to get a lot of fantasy points here. I think this is a game that you can stack. If you're somebody who plays a lot of multi-entries in tournaments, I think this is a very stackable game from both sides. Next guy we're going to talk about, we got Sam Bradford going up against Atlanta on Monday night. Now, I'm going to give you guys a little bit of a hot take here. Bradford is 6,800. And believe me, I know the case for him. You guys probably all know it too. They played really, really well. That Eagles team plays really fast. You know, they throw the ball around. They spread it around. They put up a lot of points, blah, 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 blah. But the way to attack Atlanta last year was really with the running backs. Atlanta had a horrendous run defense, especially inside the 20. Inside the 20, you could basically give it to my grandmother, and she could run it into the end zone against this Atlanta Falcons team. And that's the thing that you really have to worry about here is when they do get down into scoring range, is this going to be a team that, you know, wants to let Sam Bradford throw 4 or 5 touchdowns today? Or is this going to be a team that basically just does, you know, what everybody else has done against Atlanta for the last year and hand it to the running back, give him 3 or 4 carries and let him get into the end zone? So I think that there's a good chance that DeMarco Murray, who's somebody people aren't talking about because everyone's so enamored with Sam Bradford, is going to have a pretty big game here. And I think that that's going to hurt Bradford if all those touchdowns wind up coming on the ground to a guy like Murray. So my hot take is I think, you know, obviously for a cash game, I understand he's supposed to be a stud. They're going to get a lot of plays. He should wind up with a lot of yards. But there's definitely some merit to fading Sam Bradford in tournaments and, you know, maybe going after the running game instead. Because if DeMarco Murray has the big game and Bradford doesn't, not only are you knocking out all those people who had Bradford as their quarterback, but you're also getting a leg up because there's probably not going to be as many people on a guy like DeMarco because they're worried about the, you know, carry split. But if you look back, if you look back last year at LaShawn McCoy, he was getting 20, 25 carries. I think that DeMarco is a much better running back. So if you're going to give the same 20, 25 carries to DeMarco, especially a bunch of them in the red zone, I think he's going to wind up putting up a pretty big number for you. Now, the quarterback in this game that I do like is going to be Matt Ryan. Ryan is 7,500, so he's one of those guys right in the middle. As we said, Philly plays fast, therefore you get a lot of opportunity on the other side. They gave up the 3rd most points to fantasy quarterbacks last year, so that's another good spot for them. And Ryan is a home dog here. Whenever you're the home team and you're an underdog and you're going to be throwing late, you get the crowd behind you. You want to do a good job. You know, the crowd starts pumping you guys up when you start making a couple completions and moving the ball up the field. So I think this is a good situation for him. He was a home dog last year against the Saints in the opening game against Drew Brees. He had a big game, won a lot of people some money, you know, had a big game along with Julio Jones and Roddy White, who both had big games. Roddy White is one of the things that kind of concerns me. Both him and Jacob Tamme are a little banged up, but that's also something that I like. You know, if you look at the running backs here, you know, the running backs are a little banged up as well. Tevin Coleman is probably going to be the starter, the rookie, but I think they're going to still wind up relying on the pass game. And even if they don't rely on it early, you know, when they get down a couple scores to this Philly team, they're going to need to rely on it. So I think that that's another situation we want to look out for here. Next game I want to talk about, we have Kansas City and Houston. So we got Alex Smith coming up. Let's see, not a lot of fantasy points allowed by that Houston team. I think that Kansas City is going to keep the ball on the ground and try to run this game out. Houston's offense is probably going to struggle here. They have no running game. Alfred Blue is going to be their running back. We saw that last year where he got 20, 25 carries for like 70, 75 yards. So I think that Houston's going to wind up having to pass. I think they're going to have trouble moving the ball. I think Kansas City's going to have a lead. They're going to wind up running the ball. So I don't think you're going to get a lot of action out of Alex Smith. Hoyer on the other side, though, at minimum price is a sneaky play who I wouldn't mind using in the tournament. My thought process behind this is Kansas City's probably going to have the lead, and Alfred Blue is going to be incredibly ineffective. So they're going to have to throw the ball a little bit. Hoyer is minimum price. He does go up against a tough Kansas City team. That defense didn't give up a lot of points to fantasy quarterbacks last year, but it's a low price on him. He's got a guy like DeAndre Hopkins who can make some big plays. He's going to be throwing the ball late. He's at home. So I think that there's a sneaky case to be made for a guy like Brian Hoyer. But again, it's very risky. I might only use it for like a bullet or two in a tournament if I'm multi-entering. We got Russell Wilson going up against St. Louis. St. Louis is very stingy to fantasy quarterbacks. This is not a good spot to pay up for Wilson in. I do think that they're favored. I think they'll have a pretty run-heavy game script. I think you'll get a lot of runs from Marshawn Lynch. I don't think you're going to get a lot of points in a low over-under game, and I don't think that this is the week I want to roll out Russell Wilson. On the other side of that game, Nick Foles, well, he's cheap at 5,300, and he's going to be throwing because they're probably going to be down. The problem is he goes up against that Seattle secondary. If he's going to be throwing against that Seattle secondary, that might not end very well for him. Seattle also has a pretty good pass rush, and the offensive line for the Rams is horrendous. So I think that that's going to be a big problem for Foles. I think he's going to be on his back a lot. I think he's going to be forced to rush some throws, and I think that could make some mistakes. I mean, he did have a decent amount of interceptions and fumbles last year, and I think he's about to add to that total against the Seattle defense. Next guy we can talk about, Phillip Rivers against Detroit. Detroit gave up the third fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks last year. Rivers is only 7,100, so he's not too expensive. I just don't think this is a great spot for him. San Diego is favored, so you got to think that they might be running the ball late to run out the clock. I just don't think I love Rivers here. On the other side of that game, though, I do really like Matthew Stafford. He's the underdog, so you figure he's got to be throwing late. San Diego gave up the 8th most points to fantasy quarterbacks last year, and he has Megatron and Tate healthy. Now, last year, week 1 against the Giants, he threw for 356 yards and 2 touchdown passes when those two guys were healthy. He's at a price of only $7K, so if he was able to do that again today, he would get really, really good value out of him. So I'm a big fan of Stafford today. I think he's going to go low owned, and I think he could put up a big game against the San Diego defense and really help you win a tournament. Next thing I want to talk about, we got Carson Palmer going up against New Orleans. New Orleans gave up the 4th most points to fantasy quarterbacks last year. So Carson Palmer at 65,000. 47.5 over under in that game, and -2.5 favorite for Arizona. The thing that has me the most is Michael Floyd is probably not going to play, and he's their best big play receiver. Without him, you've got to figure you're going to have Larry Fitzgerald on one side and John Brown on the other side, and that's probably going to be the way they go about it today. I do think he's cheap. I do think he's in a good spot. I think he could be a sneaky play, but as a favorite, I don't know. I mean, I don't think they're going to be running it a lot. They do have a couple running backs now on top of Andre Ellington. They went out and drafted Johnson. So I don't know. I'm a little bit concerned. I do think that there could be some upside with Palmer, but I don't really know. On the other side of that game, we have Drew Brees. Now, Brees should be throwing late. My problem is he has the weakest set of options around him that he's had since he's been the quarterback there. Josh Hill and Ben Watson are going to be taking over for Jimmy Graham. That's a downgrade. He lost Kenny Stills. He does have Brandon Cooks back right now, but you're basically looking at Cooks and Colston as his receivers on the outside, and I just don't see a ton of upside here for him at the price of $8,000. Yes, he will be down. He does go up against an Arizona team. It's not a great matchup, but it's not a horrible one either. But I just think that there's going to be better spots to use Breeze. I don't think this is where I want him. We got Joe Flacco going up against Denver. Flacco's only 6,700. And Denver had the 7th worst fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks last year. But who is Flacco going to be throwing to? You got Steve Smith on the one side. Okay, that's not bad. But with Perryman out, you're basically looking at Kamar Aiken being the other starter on the other side. I just don't see this offense having enough weapons and enough firepower. Even though Flacco's probably going to have a lot of attempts here, I don't think he's going to wind up having a big game against this Denver team. On the other side of this game, though, here's another hot take I'm going to give you for today. I really like Peyton Manning in this spot. And let me explain to you guys why. Everybody's talking about C.J. Anderson, C.J. Anderson, C.J. Anderson. Well, Baltimore had the toughest run defense last year in the entire league. So if Baltimore is going to be tough against the run, what is Denver going to do? They're going to have to throw the ball. Now, another thing about Baltimore is they were really bad against wide receivers. I think they were about the third worst team giving up fantasy points to wide receivers. So the path of least resistance to me looks like Peyton Manning doing a lot of work on the outside to guys like Demaryius Thomas and Emmanuel Sanders. I know that's not what most people are thinking. Everyone's thinking, well, they're favored. They're going to give the ball to CJ. But again, this Baltimore team is a team that's good at stopping the run. So if they're going to be able to stop the run, you can't just keep feeding CJ if he's only getting 1 or 2 yards every carry. You're going to wind up in 3rd and 6, 3rd and 7, 3rd and 8, and those are really tough to convert. So I think they're going to throw the ball a little bit more than people expect here. It's not a high over-under game. I think that Baltimore is going to try to run the ball as much as they can to keep it close. But I do think that you can get a pretty good game out of Peyton Manning, and I think he's going to be incredibly low owned. And I don't care about the fact that his arm isn't what it used to be. I understand. It's the beginning of the season where he was one of the best quarterbacks at the beginning of the season last year. And he's still Peyton Manning. He's still going to find ways to throw touchdown passes. He's still going to find ways to put points up on the board. And I think they're going to have to pass in the red zone in order to score, because I don't think they're going to be able to pound it in with C.J. Anderson. I know that's not a popular take, but it's something that I think can help you win a tournament if you're willing to think differently. Last two guys to talk about, Colin Kaepernick. I think they're going to be down, so I think he's going to be throwing. He could be a sneaky option here at 7K. Let's see. It's not the greatest matchup overall, but again, I think he's going to have to throw. I don't really like their running game this year. I'm not a big fan of Carlos Hyde, so I think they're going to have to find some way to move the ball, and whether that's with Cap's arm or even the yards that he can pick up with his leg, I think he's a pretty sneaky option here, although I don't love him, and it's not something I would put a lot of money behind, but I definitely think it's worth a bullet or two if you're a person who multi-enters some of these big tournaments. On the other side of that game, you got Teddy Bridgewater. I don't think Minnesota's going to throw. San Francisco's D was very good last year, and they have good numbers, but they lost a lot of guys either through retirement, arrest, or just guys going to other teams. So I think they're going to be a lot weaker this year, but I kind of foresee this being a pretty run-heavy game script for them. I think they're going to see a lot of Adrian Peterson here. I think that Minnesota's going to have a lead, and I think they're going to have no reason to really sling it around. So I don't see a lot of upside for Teddy Bridgewater either. So that pretty much sums it up. That breaks down all the games that we have for week one. From the quarterback side, I will be doing a running back and wide receiver video later on this week as well. If I have time, hopefully we can get a tight end and defense video in there as well for you. If you guys have any questions, feel free to post them up in the forum. And as always, stay classy, DFS.